Hello everyone, welcome to Telos Bound. This is the first video in our Philosophy Through New Eyes series in which we analyze the questions, problems, successes, and failures of modern philosophy from a Christian perspective. This first video is on Slavoj Žižek, specifically his philosophy of subjectivity. The main thesis here is that the Bible possesses something akin to Žižek's notion of the subject, a connection that can be drawn through an analysis of the number 666 and the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. I've brought on my cousin, Nate, from the channel Wesenschau to provide an introductory explanation of 666, and after he's done so, we can begin our analysis of Žižek.
666 is all about incomplete totality. What I mean by that is that 6 is the totality of the creation week. The earth was created in 6 days, but at the same time we need to understand that the week isn't just 6 days. There has to be that 7th day of rest. There has to be the Sabbath at the end of that. God created man on the 6th day, so we can understand 6 as the number of man. It's on the 6th day that God created man as the cultivator of the earth, who was meant to go out, thank God for creation, gather creation, transforming it into something new, and bringing it to God for God to transfigure. This task was meant to find its grounding in the entering into sabbatical rest by sharing a transfigured meal with God on the 7th day of creation, the day man was tempted by the serpent. The temptation of the serpent is a temptation of pride. It's a temptation of 666, a rejection of the Sabbath. God explicitly told man not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The serpent, who is the devil, told man that God is only saying this because God is afraid that man will become too great. In reality, the serpent is aware that God plans on bringing man up above the angels, and the devil didn't like this, so he intended to hold on to his own transitory position of power, and he set himself at odds with the movement upwards towards infinity, and he fell into himself. When man sinned, listening to the temptation of the serpent, what really happened is Adam decided that God was lying to him, and that he, Adam, could account for all things without God. Instead of listening to God and accepting that the deification of man comes from God and not from man himself, Adam decided to try to grab eternal life on his own terms. Instead of defending against the serpent and allowing God to bring Adam up in the most glorifying way possible, bringing Adam into a sabbatical rest alongside himself, Adam grabbed life on his own terms and decided that he could account for reality without God. He could make himself a name. He could give himself power. He didn't need the sabbatical blessing of God to be exalted. The sabbatical blessings became sabbatical curses, and the ground became cursed. But with these curses that we hear about in Genesis 3, there still exists this eschatological promise that life will win and that the world will be glorified. God promised that despite the serpent's attack on the woman and her seed, the seed of the woman will triumph and crush the head of the serpent. This idea of the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, it becomes a theme which undergirds the Old Testament, specifically Genesis. We see all this stuff, the conflict between brothers, one brother being the seed of the serpent, one being the seed of the woman. We see this go back to Genesis 4 in the story of Cain and Abel. Cain is the seed of the serpent, and Abel is the seed of the woman. And when Cain sees that his sacrifice was not favored by God, instead of opening himself up to that which is above him and fixing his ways, he decided that he can account for all reality on his own terms, and he kills his brother. Cain has the infamous catchphrase, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And this shows us that Cain's rejection of God's hierarchy, which he's just a part of. Cain is his brother's keeper. Cain is the older brother. He's supposed to act like a good, big brother and guide Abel through life. Cain rejects these hierarchical obligations and he kills his little brother. God told Cain that Cain will be avenged sevenfold against anyone that kills him, but instead of just trusting God's protection, Cain builds a city which he can hide himself in which he can have absolute control. He withdraws from God's hierarchy and he builds himself a city which he can enclose himself in. He withdraws from reality and hides within himself, I guess you could say. Down the line of Cain's lineage, we see Lamech, and we see that Lamech killed somebody. Now, I think the person that Lamech killed was either Cain or Lamech's son Tubal-Cain, who is sort of Cain's intergenerational counterpart. But that's not something fundamental to the point that I'm making here. whether it is Cain or his intergenerational counterpart Tubal Cain or someone else that Lamech killed, we can understand this as a multiplication of the curse which pours forth from the sin of murder, from the sin of Cain himself. God is the one who placed the curse on the murderer of Cain, telling Cain that whoever kills him, or that Cain will be avenged sevenfold against whoever kills him. Whereas in Lamech's case, it is Lamech who places the curse on the murderer of Lamech. If anyone intrudes upon Lamech's own established hierarchies, Lamech will be his own blood avenger. He will play God on his own terms and kill the person who killed him. When Adam sins, he accepts God's protection in the garments of skin. When Cain sins, God protects him with the mark, but he adds his own protective means on top of that. Lamech doesn't even consider God. He just creates his own protection. We see Adam blame the other when God goes down and asks what happened. Adam blames the other. With Cain, he not only blames the other, but he also kills the other. He kills his brother. And Lamech kills and curses the other. As wickedness matures, man becomes less and less integrated in God's hierarchy, which brings all things up and connects all things in the universal unifying logos. Man disintegrates himself from the sabbatical blessings of God, and he creates his own hierarchy. He withdraws from the hierarchy of God, and he creates his own, which is just really himself, in which he is the God. He is who accounts for all things in this created hierarchy. The number 6 is the number of man without the Sabbath. It is man without the openness towards infinity, which is really what the Sabbath is. The Sabbath is the day that man cannot account for. It's the day where man opens himself up to that which is above him. It's man's openness towards God. Exodus 35 verse 3 tells the Israelites to not light a fire in their house during the Sabbath. This is because on the Sabbath, the sacrifices in the temple are doubled, so the fire in the tabernacle is doubled. The Sabbath is the putting out of your own light and the letting in of God's light. The Sabbath is that which man is not meant to account for in his own hierarchical structure. It's the submitting of man to God, whose hierarchy is greater than man's. 666 is the rejection of this and the attempt to account for all things. There are certain things which man is prescribed not to account for in the Torah. For example, like the margins of the field on the outside, which you let the foreigner take, the margins of your garments, which you leave unworked, and the Sabbath. And so 666 is the attempt at accounting for all of these marginal things. And so 666, we see the emergence of these marginal identities in a perverted, harmful way. We see this in the time of Noah especially. The Nephilim are these strange, hybrid, demon-possessed giants which exist as this result of trying to account for all things. It is in the Sabbath century of Noah's life, it's in his after his 600th year of life, that a mandatory Sabbath is sort of brought over the earth. Rest is brought to the land and wickedness is put to death. We see the wicked cursed, and we see Noah exalted on the flood waters up to Mount Ararat, where he plants a vineyard and enjoys his sabbatical rest with God. The Rephaim are another one of these giant or strange identities which are meant to remind us of the Nephilim. There are two notable Rephaim that I want to mention here. We hear about Og, who is a Rephaim, the king of Bashan, in Deuteronomy 3, and we're told that he had a bed 9 cubits by 4 cubits in size. And in 2 Samuel 21 verse 20, we hear about a nameless Rephaim who had 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand and foot, 24 in total. Og's bed is 9 by 4 cubits, 36 square cubits. 36 is 6 times 6, and the 36th triangular number is 666. If we take the sum of 36 from Og's bed and 24 as the number of digits of the nameless Rephaim, take the sum of those, we have 60. So again, we see 6 is permeating the idea of these strange hybrid identities. 666 is the attempt at accounting for these marginal identities, like giants and extra fingers, and this results in a tyranny of these marginal identities. This is the same idea behind Nebuchadnezzar's statue, which is 6 by 60 cubits. 6 times 60 is 360, and 360 calls us back to the image of the self as the pointless circle, unopened to that which is outside itself. The pointless circle is the self-referential subject. Žižek characterizes this as the infinitesimally reducible geometric point of the self. The circle can be understood as this enclosed system of infinitely reducible points. And we can understand this in the context of the thorn bush, which is really a perfect symbol of fallen man. The thorn bush has all these chaotic, disordered points. Think about how point means meaning. When we want to know the meaning of something, we ask, what's the point of this? What does this point towards? And so the thorn bush, like the fallen subject, is the infinitely pointy but simultaneously pointless circle. The Greek word stigma means point or dot. Stigma is also, it's an actual Greek letter or a ligature, and it has a numeral value of 6. It was used by the Byzantines as a symbol for the number 6, particularly in the context of 666. The stigma ligature has a sort of like an S shape, and we can think about it like the serpent on the tree, the windy, variable serpent. The serpent on the tree later becomes the bronze serpent, the symbol of redemption from the curse of the serpent. John 3 tells us that Christ is like the bronze serpent. He's the ultimate bronze serpent, the ultimate turning of death on itself. I'm not going to get too much into this, but Trey will link an article by Jonathan Pageau in the description, which talks all about this serpent imagery, the crucifixion, the bronze serpent, all of this. So I recommend reading that for more on this symbolism. But to keep this short, the bronze serpent was created and lifted up as a symbol of the serpents which were attacking the Israelites, and all those who looked upon it were healed. It was the healing of death using death. So also Christ became the bronze serpent when he entered into humanity and entered the curse of death, which we brought upon ourselves. He entered into the curse of the serpent and turned that curse on itself and turned it into a blessing. The state of death or corruption, or original sin, can be understood as the being in the ontological state of stigma, or 6, or the ontological state of being unable to move into the Sabbath, unable to open yourself up to God, or to really anything outside of yourself. Christ entered into our death, and because he is God, there is no death which can contain him. That's impossible. And so he destroyed death, and he destroyed 666, and he truly entered into sabbatical rest as a human, so that all humans may escape the ontological corruption of sin and become integrated into the body of Christ, which is the body of infinite communion between God and man. 1 Kings 10 tells us that after the Queen of Sheba departed from Solomon, he had 666 talents of gold. The Queen of Sheba can be understood as, she can be understood in the context of the other, the foreigner, the identity which cannot be accounted for, the strange woman. And it's so when she departs from Solomon that he has 666 talents of gold. St. Bede talks about the 666 talents of gold, of Solomon's gold. And he talks about how there is a true 666 talents of gold, which is the treasure of the Messiah. And he talks about how it is in the hands of the Messiah that the 666 talents of gold find their true place. And it's only when they're by themselves apart from the Messiah that they become this number of blasphemy, this number of man without God. We can understand 666 as the totality of creation in itself, the closed system of creation. But ultimately, creation by itself is finite, and no finite thing can exist in and of itself. The finite creation only exists insofar as it exists in relation to the infinite God. It's when the 666 talents of gold, or it's when 666 pretends like it exists without the Sabbath. It's when 666 encloses itself within this closed system of finitude that it becomes the number of fallen man. And that's really what hell is. It's 666. It's the withdrawal from the sabbatical opening up towards God. It's the withdrawal from God into yourself. That's really what hell is. Hell is the absolute rejection of the divine. Hell is the ultimate failure of the finite 6 to move into the Sabbath and move into the infinite. But the thing is, all things only exist in relation to the divine. finite creation only exists insofar as it relates to the infinite God. And so the total rejection of the divine is just the rejection of everything. 666 without the Sabbath is just the infinite descent into finitude. It is the continual withdrawal from every trace of the divine, which isn't even possible because everything that exists only exists in relation to the divine. So it's the withdrawal into nothing. Hell is this nonsensical, meaningless descent into nothingness for all of eternity. Hell truly is less than nothing. And so it's on the Sabbath, on the Holy Saturday, the ultimate Sabbath, where Christ comes down as the infinite God and he enters into finitude. He enters into the deepest pit of hell, the deepest finitude possible, and he transfigures it. He defeats finitude. He opens up everything from the highest heaven to the deepest pit of hell towards the infinitude of God. We talk about this so casually as if it's not the greatest and most unimaginable thing to possibly happen. And we can't really understand it until we actually join ourselves to that death and resurrection of Christ. And we join ourselves to the body of communion that is the body of Christ, the church. But anyways, just gonna sum everything up here. Revelation 13 tells us that 666 is the number of a man. More specifically, the number of man without God. The number of man trying to be God. It's the number of blasphemy. Just as in the garden, when man sinned, he chose the transitory over the eternal, so with the mark of the beast, it is the choosing of the world over God, but more ultimately, the choosing of oneself over God. When man sinned in the garden, breaking the Sabbath, not putting out his light for the light of God to shine, it caused a fundamental fracture in the movement of man towards God. And in order to reverse this, a true Sabbath needed to occur. And this true Sabbath is the Sabbath of Holy Saturday, the day Christ rested in the grave. Christ humbled himself and put out his light for the light of the Father to shine. But of course, Christ is the infinitely bright and glorious God, and he can't just put out his light. So when he entered the grave, when he entered the ultimate darkness, darkness was defeated, death was defeated, and even the lowest aspects of all reality were reintroduced to the hierarchical bringing up of creation into God. Now, on that note, I'll pass it off to Trey to talk about the more philosophical side of this.
So it's now been established that according to the Bible, the meaning of 666 is incomplete totality, and it's explicitly referred to as the number of a man in Revelation 13. This man is the man without God. Thus, the connections I'm about to draw between Žižek's philosophy of subjectivity and 666 is in no way arbitrary. The Bible already defines fallen man as the incomplete totality of 666. In order to begin analyzing and critiquing Žižek's philosophy of subjectivity, we must first clearly define his understanding of the subject. In Žižek's language, the subject is an absolute singularity. It's the center of its world. This is because he defines the subject as the void of self-relating negativity. There are three aspects of this definition that need to be defined: the void, self-relating, and negativity. The subject qua void can be easily conceptualized if we oppose it to the subject qua substantial being. The subject, as Žižek understands it, is the precise opposite of the subject in the humanist tradition. For the humanist, the human being is a wealth of inner content, filled with thoughts, emotions, and passions. Žižek refers to all of this inner life as the subject's pathological content, a term he borrows from Immanuel Kant. This pathological content, that which gives the human being a substantial personality, is opposed to the void of subjectivity. The void is precisely what remains when all of the subject's content has been removed or abstracted from it. When the subject is deprived of its thoughts, emotions, and passions, what remains is the pure, unnameable void. We can conceptualize this void as the I, the ego in its purest form, the I in the I am. Now, I just want to clarify that this is just a way to conceptualize the void for those who are new to the concept. I'm entirely aware of Lacan's distinction between the subject of enunciation and the subject of the statement and whatnot, but that's way beyond the scope of this video. In any case, now that we've determined that the void of subjectivity is the pure I, lacking any positive properties, we can now move on to discuss the concept of self-relating. For Žižek, the subject is self-relating in the sense that its activity is identical to the result of this activity. Žižek credits the philosopher Johann Fichte with this insight. Quote, "The key term positing is to be opposed here to reflecting. In self-consciousness, the I does not reflect upon itself as its own object. It directly posits itself, which means that we cannot even distinguish between the positing subject and the subject as the result of this positing. As Fichte puts it, the I absolutely posits itself as positing. It is nothing but the process of its self-positing." Fichte's formulation is very precise and has to be taken literally. It is not just that the mind relates to itself. The mind is nothing but this process of self-relating. Therein lies the circle or loop Fichte talks about. The relating itself not only creates what it relates to, it also is what it relates to." Unquote. Thus, there's no subject beneath the positing act to serve as its ground. The subject is the result of its very own act. Now, for Žižek, this self-relating subject that posits itself must be understood as self-relating negativity. Negativity in the sense of the negative, the not this and not that. Negativity is the opposite of positivity. It inherently lacks any positive content. It is the very withdrawal from all positivity. Now, as we've already determined, the subject is the void. It's precisely the nothingness of self-relating negativity. One may now ask how the subject can be the void of self-relating negativity yet nonetheless exist. And Žižek's answer to this question is objet A. Objet A is the objectal counterpoint of the void of subjectivity. It gives body, as it were, to the nothingness of subjectivity. The negating of subjectivity must have a point from which it negates. This point is objet A. It's the hole in the field of representation that makes it possible. To quote Žižek, "What Fichte failed to see was that, in the subject-object relationship, the subject is a negative entity, a pure self-relating negativity, which is why, in order not to implode into itself, it needs a minimum of objectal support." That is to say, although Fichte repeatedly emphasizes how the subject is not a thing, but a self-relating process, he conceives of the subject in an all too positive way when he claims that the absolute I is all reality. The subject is, on the contrary, a whole in reality. As such, the I is in no position to transfer its reality onto the not I. On the contrary, it is itself in need of a little bit of reality to regain its minimum consistency. Unquote. It's through the subtraction constitutive of the void of subjectivity that objet A is produced as its result. Now, we've gotten extremely technical here, and if you aren't fully following along, that's completely fine for the purposes of this video. But just to summarize, Žižek understands the subject as self-relating negativity, a void without any positive properties such as thoughts or emotions. This void is embodied in what he calls objet A, which is simply the whole in reality that is the source of the field of representation, but in being its source, it's incapable of being placed within it. Now, because the subject is self-relating, it's incapable of truly confronting otherness. This is what makes it absolute. We covered this concept in the video on Žižek's concept of absolute knowing, so a simple quote will suffice for our purposes. Quote, "This is why our thesis is that of a contingent absolute. Once the subject emerges, it is absolute, the point of reference of its world from which it is not possible too abstract, although its emergence is thoroughly contingent. Absolute does not mean omnipotent, all-knowing, or anything similar. Absolute describes an entity whose relating to other entities is always mediated by its self-relating. What this means is that absolute can be said to designate the subject's self-limitation, its inability to step outside its own horizon, unquote. To shed light on this idea, we can conceptualize it in opposition to the Christian idea of communion, the mutual indwelling of distinct things in one another. The Trinity is the ultimate example of communion, as the three divine persons are fully interior to one another despite remaining distinct. This constitutes God's eternal act of communal love. Human beings are invited to enter into this communion so that they may become deified, but in order to do this, they must renounce themselves as absolute through the embrace of the other, which is made possible by the grace of God. This is why Christianity emphasizes the virtues of humility, self-sacrifice, and most importantly, love. Žižek's notion of the subject of self-relating negativity is the precise opposite of the subject of communion, a being that instead of transcending itself through embracing the other, withdraws into the abyss of its own self-relating and is, in fact, nothing more than this very withdrawing. In being the void of self-relating negativity, the subject is unable to escape its transcendental horizon, to experience something truly other. 666 is precisely a self-relating system that withdraws from God and posits its own absoluteness. Fallen man, as the 666, is homologous to Žižek's void of self-relating negativity. I really want to emphasize this point. 666 is self-relating. It exists for its own glorification as opposed to the glorification of God. Creation on the sixth day was already complete in itself, but the seventh day was still required, as this is the day that God looks upon his creation and blesses it. But the 666 rejects God absolutely. It rejects the seven and attempts to totalize itself as absolute without any reference to the transcendent other. This is precisely what the fallen subject does insofar as it's understood as nothing more than its own self-relating act and not as an inherently communal being. To quote a passage from my book, Aphasis, The Impossibility of Subjectivity, there is yet another paradox at the heart of subjectivity. The subject is individual, yet it necessarily experiences itself as universal. In being nothing more than its own self-relation, the subject is incapable of escaping itself to come to terms with otherness. It's able to individuate itself. It is, in fact, constituted by this very individuation, but it can never take this individualization to the furthest conclusion, to see itself as merely one amongst a plurality of individuals in the world. It is its own totality, and everything external can only become available to it through the mediation of its transcendental circle, unquote. We've now confronted what I call the impossibility of intersubjectivity or mutual recognition. For the fallen subject, the existence of another equally existing subject is a radical scandal. This is because it experiences itself as a totality, as a universality, but the other subject presents itself as an equally existing universality. In this sense, when one subject confronts another, there is the radical scandal of two universalities being present when there's only room for one. To quote Žižek, "As a subject, I am by definition alone, a singularity opposed to the entire world of things, a punctuality to which all the world appears, and all phenomenological descriptions of my being always together with others cannot ultimately cover up the scandal of there being another such singularity," unquote. This is why Žižek will say that
the most radically new thing is not to discover an alien or whatever, but to say, fuck it, another self-consciousness. It cannot be.
To use a Christian term, Žižek is touching on the inherent pridefulness of the human subject. This is a concept that I personally don't think Žižek has fully accounted for in his work, but that's beyond the scope of this video. The point to take away from this is that the division between the subject and the object in terms of the Kantian gap, the fact that the object always appears within a certain transcendental horizon, isn't the only division that results from the subject's self-relating. The true scandal doesn't occur between the subject and the object, but between the subject and the other subject that claims to be its equal. So we've now drawn a few connections between 666 and Žižek's subject. Both are constituted by self-relating, both experience themselves as absolute totalities, both exist in a negative opposition to that which is external, and both contain an inherent pridefulness insofar as they can't affirm the equality of the other or the authority of God. Now let's move on to talk about the concept of immanence. The subject, or man, understood as a self-relation, possesses an immanent or internal perspective. The consequence of self-relation, or the rejection of communion, is immanence. As I discussed in my video on the concept of immanence, reality from the immanent or internal perspective is inherently incomplete or non-all. It can't totalize itself as a fully consistent whole, as 666 attempts to do. This is because to totalize is to delimit, to posit the boundaries of a given field, and to thereby constitute it as whole. We can understand God's gaze on the seventh day as this transcendent as opposed to immanent perspective which totalizes and delimits creation as a harmonious and consistent totality. My belief is that the Bible is essentially saying that in order to have a whole and consistent creation or reality, God must be present. And this is a conclusion that modern philosophy has also drawn. Now, the philosophical result of rejecting immanence, the highest expression of which being God, is the incompleteness of reality. If there's no transcendent perspective, what Lacan would call the big other, there's no ability to constitute reality as whole, it always remains non-all or incomplete. The subject, conceptualized by Žižek, is the most radical form of this incompleteness, a being that's nothing more than its immanent self-relation. Žižek's quote-unquote solution to the incompleteness that results as a consequence of immanence is to consider incompleteness a property of reality itself. Quote, "Not only as substance, but also as subject, does not mean simply that substance is really a force of subjective self-mediation, but that substance is in itself ontologically flawed, incomplete. This is what Hegel clearly saw against the subjectivist tradition which piques in Fichte's notion of the self-positing of the absolute I. The subject does not come first. It is not a new name for the one which grounds all, but the name for the inner impossibility or self-blockage of the one." Unquote. This is essentially the essence of Žižek's entire philosophy. It constitutes his shift from Kant to Hegel. For Kant, the antinomies of reason point to an epistemological limit unique to man, while for Hegel, reality itself is antinomic, and our confrontation with antinomies simply testifies to our inscription into reality. Self-relation and immanence characterize Hegel's thought, which is why the Hegelian idea is one that follows its own internal logic. It has no recourse to an external other that could act as the standard by which truth is measured. The entirety of Hegel's science of logic begins with the concept of pure being, which, of course, negates itself, and the rest of the book is simply a description of the process of negation and reconciliation that stems entirely from the empty concept of being. Hegel, then, is the ultimate philosopher of self-relating and immanence. To quote Žižek, "The properly Hegelian solution to this dilemma is that a truly radical change is self-relating. It changes the very coordinates by means of which we measure change. In other words, a true change sets its own standards. It can only be measured by criteria that result from it." Unquote. This is why absolute knowing, according to Žižek, is simply the recognition of immanence or the fact that there is no external standard by which truth is measured. Quote, "This is what Hegel means by absolute idealism, not the magical ability of spirit to generate all content, but spirit's thorough passivity. Adopting the stance of absolute knowing, the subject does not ask if the content meets some a priori standard. It lets the content measure itself by its own immanent standards, and thus self-authorizes itself. The stance of absolute knowing thus fully coincides with thorough, absolute historicism. There is no transcendental big other. There are no criteria that we can apply to historical phenomena to judge them. All such criteria must be immanent to the phenomena themselves." Unquote. It should be evident how this relates to 666. In fact, is Hegel's system not the ultimate philosophical form of 666, a philosophy which attempts to account for totality without any reference to an external other? Žižek would argue otherwise because he emphasizes that Hegel's totality is precisely non-all, and that absolute knowing is simply the reconciliation with the non-all of reality and one's own subjectivity. To translate this into Christian terms, Žižek's interpretation of Hegel is a paradoxical 666 with humility, a totality that recognizes and accepts its own incompleteness. With this established, it becomes clear where a Christian critique of Žižek should be aimed, as according to Christianity, there is no humility in the absence of God. To my knowledge, there has only been one attempt to demonstrate that Žižek's absolute knowing fails to do what it purports to do, and it can be found in my own book, Aphasis, the Impossibility of Subjectivity. The book isn't currently available, but I'm working on a revised edition that will be out soon. So I would now like to briefly outline why I believe the modern Cartesian subject, as understood by Žižek, points towards the truth of Christ. In fact, my conversion to Orthodox Christianity was directly the result of my engagement with the philosophy of subjectivity. In my previously mentioned book, I came to the conclusion that there are at least 3 impossibilities of subjectivity. They are as follows: the subject can't know itself, the subject can't know others, and the subject can't reach a final absolute state, which is to say, it always negates itself. However, what I soon realized is that these 3 impossibilities can be inverted into the 3 constitutive elements of subjectivity. The subject is self-conscious, the subject knows others, and the subject maintains an identity over time. And in a certain sense, all of these are true. We're all self-conscious, we're obviously able to interact with one another, and we're all able to maintain a relatively stable sense of self over a period of time. But as we've determined in this video and other videos that are linked in the description, we can only do these things partially. The conclusion I draw is that the subject fails to be itself. It fails to embody its notion. It's like a tool that's broken, and it can't do what it's meant to do. And is this not the very definition of fallen man according to the Bible? Man was meant to cultivate and populate the earth under God, and instead he rebelled against God and failed in his duties. In Christianity, the highest goal is communal love. Man is meant to commune with God, and by extension, all of creation. It's no coincidence that the fallen subject is in a middle state of communion and solipsism, or heaven and hell. It's also no coincidence that, as we've determined, this fallen subject is homologous to 666, the number of a man. I personally understand the self-relating void of identity as the kingdom of Satan that dwells in our hearts on account of original sin, the stain of the nous, to use the Orthodox term. On the other hand, the kingdom of heaven is the nous itself, the aspect of man's soul that communes with God. My speculative thesis is that hell is the self-relating void fully actualized, something akin to Žižek's description of the subject in the wired brain. In fact, this is an idea that I share with Seraphim Hamilton, who just so happened to describe the state of damnation as less than nothing in J. Dyer's Discord, despite never having read Žižek. To quote him, "Damnation is constituted by the total rejection of all things containing a trace of the divine. But that's just a rejection of all things. It is a nonsense world which is less than non-experience. One might say that it is a kind of inverted apophaticism. We say that God is known apophatically because there is always more to know. But for the damned, there is less than nothing to know, less than nothing to experience, and so no language could possibly have its meaning in that context." Unquote. What I call aphasis is the salvation of the subject, the overcoming of the impossibilities of subjectivity. This occurs through communion with God. Briefly put, we know ourselves through entering into the infinity of God and transcending our finite creaturely perspective. We know others through the Holy Spirit, which unites us, and we reach a final state of identity by having all our internal potentialities actualized. The term aphasis is used in the Bible and means letting go of sin. I didn't know this when I chose the term, but Žižek defines absolute knowing as letting go as well. But in his case, it's the letting go of the object. I hope I've demonstrated that a Christian absolute knowing would be a letting go of sin. Sin is nothing more than self-relating insofar as being is communion and sin is nothingness. Aphasis is the letting go of sin through turning away from oneself and towards Christ, and is therefore a part of what in Orthodoxy we call theosis or deification. Now I just want to say that this whole thesis is in its beginning stages and I plan on developing it far more in the future. I just wanted to outline these basic connections here. Now, as we near the end of the video, I'd like to briefly talk about Žižek's notion of the end of history and how it relates to 666. For Žižek, the end of history signifies the fact that every historical epoch experiences itself as the end, as a culmination of historical development, in the same way the subject experiences itself as absolute. Quote, "At every given historical moment, we speak from within a finite horizon that we perceive as absolute. Every epoch experiences itself as the end of history." Unquote. In other words, we're condemned to experience ourselves as the end of history. We can't step back and locate ourselves as just one amongst a plurality of particular historical moments, precisely because our perspective is always from within the present moment. Now, Žižek will go on to say that while every historical epoch experiences itself as total or absolute, it's also paradoxically unable to constitute itself as a totality. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time here, as this is essentially the same logic that was laid out in detail in the previous sections on subjectivity. Now it's just applied to history itself. So, to quote Žižek, Hegel is wrong in his basic presupposition that one can rationally grasp the present as a totality. It cannot be done because our historical present is in itself split, traversed by antagonisms, incomplete. The only way to concretely grasp it as a rational totality is from the standpoint of the revolutionary agent, which will resolve those antagonisms." Unquote. There is no big other, who in this case stands for the revolutionary agent, who would be able to constitute the present as a rational totality. It's always incomplete. But Žižek's already determined that the present moment is the end of history. It experiences itself as total. So how does he reconcile these two opposite conclusions? He does so by stating that, quote, "The totality of the present is complete in its very incompleteness." Unquote. Is this not the very definition of 666, the system which is total yet incomplete? The end of history, just like the subject, is an incomplete totality. Thus, the reign of the Antichrist will constitute a system that not only unconsciously experiences itself as the end of history, but openly declares itself as such. Now, to end the video, I'd like to discuss how the incomplete totality of subjectivity in history without God isn't just a philosophical or theological thesis, it's actually a mathematically verifiable fact. In his video on the meaning of 666, Jonathan Pageau provides an example of a mathematical proof of the necessity of 7 by way of a circle. Quote, "Matthieu gives us the key to the circle and explains that if you use the radius of a circle to measure a circle, you get 6 lengths, and then you get a 7th length, which is a remainder, which is not part of the 6 measurements, and that 7th day, that's the completeness, not the coherence, but the completeness, the totality which includes the fringe, which includes all those things that can't be counted." Unquote. This is a great example of a mathematical proof of the logic of 666 and the necessity of 7, but I dare say I found an even better one, and that's Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which essentially state the following, quote, "He proved that any set of axioms you could posit as a possible foundation for math will inevitably be incomplete. There will always be true facts about numbers that cannot be provided by those axioms. He also showed that no candidate set of axioms can ever prove its own consistency." Unquote. No mathematical system can prove its own consistency, and there will always remain certain statements within it that cannot be proved. This is mathematical proof of the incompleteness of immanence. From within any field or system, there's no ability to perform any true totalization, to constitute anything as a consistent whole. This is irrefutable evidence of the biblical logic of the 7th day, the fact that this day of rest is necessary to constitute creation as complete. 666 is an incomplete totality because it's a system that tries to prove its own consistency immanently without reference to God. Now, to really conclude, I just want to mention that the very existence of dissent against the beast disproves its totality. The existence of the saints who refused the mark signified the incompleteness of 666, the fact that it isn't a true totality. This is why the saints are persecuted by the beast, and have been throughout history. In the same way, the existence of God disproves the autonomy or self-sufficiency of man, which is why Satan increasingly attacks Christians as they progress in humility and love. Now, we are fallen. We're stuck within the sixth day. We're not fully stuck, however. We're not yet the 666, but we are nonetheless fallen beings. And this is why faith in God is necessary. We have to step out of ourselves through the grace of God, and in this way we'll enter into the eternal seventh day of blessed rest. My guess is that this has turned out to be the longest non-interview video we've ever done, and I really hope you got some value out of it, even if it was maybe a little technical and unclear at times, especially at the beginning. I'll be doing more videos relating modern philosophy to Christianity, because I think Christianity, specifically Orthodox Christianity, provides such a beautiful and rich framework for understanding the world. So please comment any questions or takes you have, and I don't usually ask this, but please send this video to anyone that you think would find it interesting. That's all I've got for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and may God bless you all.